Heroes of History, Ben Carson, A Chance at Life, Janet and Geoff Benge. Chapter 13, Blazing the Path. The next day, Ben's phone rang, and the day after that. Everyone, it seemed, wanted to hear about Ben's successful brain surgery on Miranda Francisco. Don Colburn, an award-winning writer for the Washington Post, interviewed Ben, along with Terry and Louis Francisco. From the interviews, he wrote a long article outlining the breakthrough surgery and the Francisco's reaction to it. Evening Magazine, a well-known TV show, featured hemispherectomies as an up-and-coming new procedure. Soon, Miranda herself was well enough to make an appearance on the Phil Donahue Show. It wasn't long before Ben discovered just how many people across the United States knew about him and the surgery he had performed. He began receiving a trickle of phone calls and letters from parents around the country who had been told there was no hope for their child and that he or she would die because of some brain complications. These people wanted to know if by some miracle Ben and his team might be able to help their son or daughter. One such person was Brian Usher, the father of a 6-year-old girl named Beth. Brian was the assistant football coach at the University of Connecticut. He and his wife had done everything they could to figure out what was wrong with their daughter. One day, Beth's mom, Kathy, read an article about Ben and Miranda and called John Hopkins. Ben and Dr. Freeman met with the family. They set up a series of tests that confirmed their worst fears. Beth had Rasmussen's encephalitis, just like Miranda Francisco. At first, her parents did not want to believe that the outlook for their vivacious little girl could be so grim. They felt that Beth's seizures were becoming less frequent, down to just 10 a week, and they hoped that she might be able to outgrow them. Ben knew better, but he could not override the parents' optimism. Over the next few months, Ben continued to pray for Beth and her family, and to wait until they realized just how serious the situation was. In the meantime, other complicated cases were arriving at the hospital for consultations. One of the most difficult cases was that of 13-year-old Denise Baca, a former straight-A student and cheerleader from New Mexico. Ben had already read Denise's medical history before he met her. She was in bad shape. She suffered from seizures that were so close together, they interfered with her ability to breathe. Doctors had put her on a machine to control her breathing and had performed a tracheotomy, inserting a breathing tube directly into her neck. Things had gotten so bad for Denise that she was paralyzed on one side and had not spoken for 2 months before she slipped into a coma. Doctors in New Mexico told the Bacas there was nothing they could do for her, but a family friend had found an article about Ben and encouraged the parents to call John Hopkins. Ben felt that the team at the hospital might be able to help Denise, but he wasn't sure. He had to evaluate her in person. This was difficult, since Denise had to be transported in a medevac helicopter to Baltimore and then brought to the hospital by ambulance. When Denise finally arrived, Ben braced himself for controversy. He had already talked with several other prominent surgeons at the hospital about the possibility of performing a hemispherectomy on Denise. One surgeon in particular thought Ben was irresponsible to even consider a drastic step, outlining 3 reasons why he thought it was a crazy idea. First, Denise was 13 years old, too old, it was believed, for half her brain to take over the functions of the other half if it were removed. Second, Denise was very ill. Her lungs were failing, and she might not survive a long and complicated surgery. And third, the seizures were coming from areas of her brain that made surgery risky. Ben and the members of his department held several conferences regarding Denise so that everyone could air their concerns, but the medical staff remained in 2 distinct camps. There were those like Ben and Dr. Freeman who believed a hemispherectomy was Denise's best chance, her only chance, in fact, for living. Others lined up on the other side, saying that she would surely die on the operating table and make everyone at Johns Hopkins look like rebels who cared less about their patients than they did about crazy experiments on very ill children. The conflict stressed Ben, and more so when one of the opposing doctors wrote a letter to the hospital president, warning him of the operation Ben was planning to undertake. Nonetheless, Ben felt that the operation was the only thing that could possibly save Denise's life, and she deserved that chance. Denise's parents agreed and waited patiently for Ben and his team to schedule a date for the surgery. At last, Ben felt that he could wait no longer. Denise was getting weaker every day. The doctor who had objected the most to the surgery had gone overseas to attend a 5-day medical conference. While he was away, Ben performed the hemispherectomy. Denise was in a coma for several days. Everyone watched closely to see if she would come out of it and what kind of permanent disabilities she might have if she did. Thankfully, Denise did wake up, seizure-free. She slowly learned to talk again, and within a few months, she was back in school and doing well. Ben was glad that things had turned out well and that the success of the surgery had silenced his critics. It was challenging to stand up and believe that he could do something for a patient's condition when other experienced surgeons were calling him crazy. Soon after Denise's successful surgery, Beth Usher and her parents returned to see Ben. Ben did not like what he saw. Beth's speech was slurred, and she was losing control over her muscles. Once again, Ben tried to convince the Ushers to allow him to operate on their daughter, but they could not allow anyone to take away half of Beth's brain. All Ben could do was watch and wait. In the meantime, Ben became a father for the 3rd time. Just before Christmas, on December 21st, 1986, Candy gave birth, in the hospital this time, to another son, whom they named Royce. Murray had just turned 3 and BJ was 1.5, which meant Candy had her hands full. Thankfully, Ben's mother was ready for a change in her life. She agreed to move in with the family and help out with the 3 boys. Ben was delighted to have his mother living with them, especially when he overheard her giving his sons the same advice she'd given him and Curtis when they were young. After Christmas, the Ushers returned to see Ben. They were ready to do whatever he thought necessary to save their daughter's life. Ben immediately scheduled the hemispherectomy. He was pleased with how well the surgery went. He encountered no complications in the process of separating and removing half of Beth's brain. However, following the operation, Beth did not wake up. Ben was a little worried by this and had a CT scan done to see if there was something he had missed. The scan showed that Beth's brainstem was swollen, but Ben expected that. It was normal, given the radical surgery Beth had just undergone. Once the swelling in her brainstem goes down, she'll get better, Ben assured Brian and Kathy Usher following the surgery. Ben wasn't sure whether the parents believed him or not. In the pediatric intensive care unit, the Ushers stood by their daughter's bedside and waited. But nothing about Beth's condition changed. Beth's chest rose and fell in time to the respirator as she continued in a comatose state. Ben felt for the Ushers as he watched them. All they wanted was for their daughter to wake up. And that was also what Ben wanted more than anything else. Ben was certain that it would happen when her brain had had enough time to heal. He talked the situation over with Dr. Freeman, who agreed with Ben's assessment. Despite Ben's optimism, the days rolled by with no change in Beth's condition. Ben checked on his patient daily, going over her chart to see if there was any change. Every day it became more difficult for him to face the Ushers and reassure them that their daughter would be okay. The look of despair and dejection on their faces told him they didn't really believe him. In truth, by now, Ben was starting to doubt himself. Yet the hospital staff remained supportive of Ben. They encouraged him and told him everything would work out okay with Beth. Ben was appreciative of their support, but Beth Usher's condition weighed heavily on him. Eventually, Beth's physical condition improved enough for her to be taken off the respirator and breathe on her own. But she remained in a coma. Once off the respirator, Beth was moved to a pediatric care ward. Beth's parents spent as much time with their daughter as possible. They often took turns sleeping on a cot in the room with Beth. About 2 a.m. on a night when Brian was sleeping over, he heard, "Daddy, my nose itches," coming from the bed beside him. "What?" he asked as he scrambled from the cot. "My nose itches, Daddy," came the reply. The nurses on duty that night explained to Ben what happened next. Brian was so excited that he rushed from the room and ran down the corridor yelling, "Beth talked! Beth talked!" In his excitement, he had forgotten that he was only wearing his underwear. "She says her nose itches," he exclaimed excitedly when he reached the nurse's station. The nurses and doctor on duty raced to Beth's room. Sure enough, Beth was lying in bed with her eyes open and a smile on her face. When they entered the room, she said, "My nose really does itch. A lot." When he heard the news, Ben was delighted and relieved. Beth had finally woken from her coma, just as Ben had believed she would, even in those times when he had doubted himself. Day by day, Beth began to make a remarkable recovery. Ben watched as Beth returned to the bubbly little girl she had been before Rasmussen's encephalitis had ravaged her brain. Six months later, Ben organized a special reunion. Rather than have the HEMA patients, as he dubbed them, return one at a time for their 4 days of testing and ongoing assessment, Ben decided to have them return all together once a year for a celebratory reunion. That way, the children who had undergone hemispherectomies could meet each other, while their parents had the opportunity to swap stories about their experiences. On the last Saturday of August 1987, Ben and his team welcomed the 8 young hemispherectomy patients and their families for a picnic on the Johns Hopkins University lawn. Beth Usher was there with her parents, who shook their heads when they saw Ben. "We kept wondering," Kathy confided in him. "How can you take out half a brain and still have a whole person?" "But you can. Beth proves it. She's every bit as funny and bubbly as she was before the operation." Ben grinned as 14-year-old Denise Baca rolled up beside him. She looked like any other teenage girl with her star-shaped earrings and bright pink nail polish. "I'm getting better at walking every day," she told Ben. "I'll be out of this wheelchair soon." "I'm sure you will," Ben said, rubbing his beard, and he believed it. The evidence of amazing recoveries was all around him, yet Ben also knew that there would be some ongoing loss of neurological function as a result of having half a brain removed. For example, the HEMA patients would remain blind in one half of each eye, since vision cannot transfer from one brain hemisphere to the other. And they would experience some degree of weakness or paralysis on the side of their bodies opposite the hemisphere of the brain that was removed. Some loss of fine motor movement in the fingers was also inevitable, making it difficult for a patient to pick up very small objects with one hand. Physical therapy was able to lessen some of the side effects. Ben advised all of his young patients not to play football without a helmet, dive into a swimming pool or the ocean, or engage in other full contact activities such as karate or boxing. Other than that, they should all go on to lead relatively normal lives free from the seizures that had led to their surgeries in the first place. As the last child left the picnic, Ben paused for a moment to think of one of his smallest patients. Jennifer had been only 5 months old the first time he had operated on her, taking out the back part of the right side of her brain. Everything had gone well at first, but then Jennifer's seizures had started up again. Ben had felt the best treatment option was to perform a full hemispherectomy and take out the rest of the right side of her brain. He had done that just a month before. By then, Jennifer was 11 months old. The second round of surgery had gone well, but while Ben was driving home after the operation, his beeper went off. Jennifer had stopped breathing. Ben raced back to the hospital and joined the team trying to resuscitate her. An hour and a half later, they gave up and his patient was pronounced dead. Ben knew he would never forget telling Jennifer's parents the sad news. He only got the words, "I'm sorry," out before he started to cry. It was something he had never done in front of a patient's family before, but he could not help it. The family had been on such a roller coaster ride. Things seemed to be going so well, and then suddenly it was over. Their daughter was dead. Just the day before the picnic, Ben had gone over the investigation of Jennifer's death. The autopsy gave no clues, and the cause of death was listed as undetermined. Jennifer's death would have to remain a mystery, one that left a gaping hole in Ben's heart. Ben wondered whether he would ever completely recover from losing Jennifer. "She should have been here today," he told himself as he walked to his car. Later that night, Ben knelt beside his bed to pray. He chose to focus on the amazing event he'd witnessed that day. 8 children, all of whom would have been dead or dying without his intervention, had played and eaten fried chicken together on the university lawn, while the parents swapped notes on their children's progress. It was the first time in history such an event had taken place, and Ben thanked God for the opportunity to be part of it. He was grateful that he had chosen to spend his career at a teaching hospital such as Johns Hopkins. Now that he had completed 8 successful hemispherectomies, many other hospitals in the United States and around the world would develop their own teams to perform the operation. Ben and his team had blazed a path other neurosurgeons would follow. As Ben knelt, he prayed for 2 other babies, German twins named Patrick and Benjamin Binder. In fact, just 3 months before, Ben and a team of doctors had flown to West Germany to visit the boys and assess the possibility of helping them. Now the team was about to enter uncharted medical territory. Ben would be attempting something that had never been done before, a surgery that would thrust him into the world's spotlight.